Water doesn't scream when it's poisoned. It just goes quiet. That's what I was thinking the morning the lake stopped moving. The air should have smelled like wet cedar and spring algae, the way it always does in early May. But instead there was a sharp chemical tang riding the mist, something clean and wrong at the same time. I was standing on the old wooden dock my grandfather built in 1974, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at silver flashes beneath the surface. At first I thought it was just the light catching the water. Then one of the bays rolled sideways. White belly. Still. The lake was 37 acres of private reservoir tucked behind my house in Willow Creek County, Texas. It wasn't some decorative pond the HOA could list in their brochure next to the community pool and pickleball courts. My grandfather dug it with 2 rented bulldozers and a handshake water rights agreement that later turned into a notarized deed recorded downtown. I grew up learning how to read its currents the way other kids learned to read comic books. When the wind shifted, I could tell you which cove would warm first. When the spillway hummed after heavy rain, I knew exactly how many inches we'd gained overnight. My name's Daniel Whitmore, and that lake isn't a hobby. It's legacy. It's groundwater recharge. It's a legally protected reservoir that feeds the aquifer running under 214 homes that sit on the other side of my fence. Rebecca Hale likes to pretend that detail doesn't exist. Rebecca is 51, 3-term HOA president, drives a white Range Rover, and wears pastel tennis skirts like she's campaigning for something bigger than a cul-de-sac. 2 months ago, she stood at the edge of my property line, manicured nails gripping the fence, telling me the community deserved kayak access. I told her no. Calm. Simple. Private property. The smile she gave me didn't reach her eyes. She said I was being unreasonable. I said I was being lawful. This morning, looking at fish drifting near the reeds, I could almost hear her voice again. The surface of the water had a faint sheen, not thick, not obvious, just enough to bend the reflection of the sunrise into something distorted. I knelt down and dipped my fingers in. The water felt normal, cool, maybe 62 degrees, but when I lifted my hand to my face, the scent hit harder. Chlorine. Not pool-level strong, but present. Intentional. The kind of treatment someone uses to sanitize a body of water they think is decorative. A red-winged blackbird landed on a post and went silent. Even the usual hum from the pump house down the hill seemed lower, hesitant. I straightened up slowly, heart steady, mind already moving through permits, statutes, environmental codes. They thought they were stopping me from fishing. They thought if the water looked uninviting, I'd give in, sign some shared use agreement, let them turn my grandfather's reservoir into a weekend amenity. What they didn't understand, what Rebecca Hale definitely didn't understand, is that the same water lapping against my dock is the water that runs through every kitchen faucet in Willow Creek Estates. And when you tamper with a source, you don't just change the surface. You change everything downstream. I did not call the police right away. I did not march down to the HOA office or start knocking on doors. I walked back to the pump house instead, boots crunching over gravel that had not changed in 40 years, and unlocked the steel door my grandfather painted hunter green. The air inside was cool and damp, humming softly from the pressure regulator that fed the secondary line toward the subdivision. Most people in Willow Creek Estates think their water comes from a distant municipal plant. It does not. The city supplements in drought season, but for 9 months out of the year, the aquifer under my land does the heavy lifting. My reservoir keeps that aquifer stable. It recharges it, filters through limestone and clay, and keeps the wells from pulling air. I flipped on the overhead light and listened. The pumps sounded steady, but there was a faint irregular click in the intake line, the kind that happens when water chemistry shifts and sensors start adjusting flow. I crouched beside the control panel and checked the digital readout. Chlorine levels in the raw intake were higher than baseline. Not catastrophic, not yet, but elevated. Enough to trip an advisory if it reached distribution. I pulled a sterile sample bottle from the cabinet, filled it carefully, sealed it, labeled it with the time down to the minute. Years working as a civil water systems engineer taught me one thing. Documentation beats outrage every time. When I stepped back, outside, the sun had climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing more pale shapes near the shoreline. I could hear a lawn mower start up across the fence line, the ordinary rhythm of suburban life carrying on like nothing was wrong. A delivery truck rolled past on Willow Creek Drive. Somewhere a sprinkler hissed. I imagined kitchen faucets turning on, coffee makers filling, children brushing their teeth with water drawn from the same underground channel that started here. Rebecca had framed this as a neighborhood dispute about recreation. She sent emails about community wellness, about shared green spaces, about how private control of natural beauty felt exclusionary. She never mentioned watershed maps. She never mentioned recharge rates or dependency charts. I keep those in a flat file drawer in my home office, along with the original 1972 water rights deed stamped in blue ink. When I bought out my cousins and consolidated the title 5 years ago, I also secured the easement language that protects the reservoir from chemical interference. The clause is clear. Any contamination event requires immediate reporting to the county and temporary suspension of downstream distribution until testing confirms safety. It is not dramatic. It is procedural. I stood at the edge of the dock again and watched a faint ripple move across the surface, wind finally picking up from the south at maybe 8 miles per hour. The lake looked peaceful if you did not know what to look for. Rebecca probably assumed I would argue about fish stock or property values. She probably assumed I would try to negotiate access. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened the county environmental compliance portal. If someone had introduced chlorine into a private reservoir connected to a residential aquifer, there was a process for that. And once that process starts, it does not ask who the HOA president is. I submitted the contamination report at 9:17 in the morning. The confirmation email hit my inbox before the wind shifted again across the water. Subject line, environmental incident logged. Case number assigned. Estimated response time, same day. That is the thing about water infrastructure in Texas. You can argue about fence lines all day, but once you mention aquifer impact, the tone changes. I walked back into the pump house and flipped the secondary valve to manual override, reducing outflow to the subdivision by 15%. Not enough to trigger immediate complaints, just enough to stabilize the intake while testing ran. The metal wheel felt cool and solid in my palm, steady resistance, familiar as a handshake. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up fully. I could hear garage doors opening in sequence, a school bus braking at the corner, dogs barking behind privacy fences that all matched by HOA decree. My phone buzzed with a new email, then another. Rebecca had already sent a community blast. Subject line, possible algae bloom at private pond. She described it as seasonal discoloration and advised residents not to worry. She attached a stock photo of harmless green water and signed it with her usual polished confidence. Reading it, I could almost see her standing in her kitchen, sunlight on granite countertops, typing with that composed half-smile. She was trying to frame the narrative before facts arrived. I set the sample bottle in a padded cooler and drove into town, the 2-lane road curving past cedar and limestone outcroppings my grandfather used to call stubborn earth. At the independent lab on Main Street, I handed the technician the sealed bottle and requested expedited testing for chlorine concentration and foreign agents. She raised an eyebrow when I mentioned reservoir linkage. "We will prioritize this," she said, sliding the sample into a stainless rack. Back at the lake by early afternoon, the sun was high and unforgiving, light bouncing hard off the surface. The sheen was more visible now, thin streaks catching the glare. A pickup truck rolled slowly along the fence line on the subdivision side. Rebecca stepped out, sunglasses on, phone in hand. Even at a distance I could read her posture. Upright, certain. She gestured toward the water as if presenting evidence to an invisible audience. I did not walk over. I stayed by the dock and watched. Within the hour, the county environmental officer called. His voice was calm, procedural. He confirmed receipt of my report and asked one question that mattered. Is this reservoir hydraulically connected to residential wells? I answered yes. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Then we are initiating precautionary review. You may need to suspend distribution pending lab results. Suspend distribution. That phrase carries weight. It means advisory notices. It means pressure drops. It means residents wondering why their showers are weaker than usual. I looked across the fence again. Rebecca was still there, arms crossed now, talking animatedly to someone out of frame. She believed this was about fishing rights. She believed it was about access and appearances. She had no idea that a single chemical decision made before sunrise was about to move from gossip on a neighborhood app to a county file stamped urgent. And once water enters the record, it does not stay private for long. By late afternoon, the first signs showed up in places Rebecca could not filter with a cheerful email. A faint drop in shower pressure. A sputter in kitchen sinks. Not dramatic, not alarming, just enough to make people check their faucets twice. My phone stayed quiet, but I could imagine the group messages lighting up across Willow Creek Estates. I was back inside the pump house, sunlight cutting through the small window and striping the concrete floor, when the county truck rolled up in a cloud of pale dust. 2 environmental officers stepped out, both wearing navy polos with the county seal stitched over the chest. They shook my hand, professional and direct, and asked to see the intake line and distribution panel. I walked them through the system slowly, explaining recharge flow, seasonal variance, the easement that connects the reservoir to the shared aquifer. The hum of the regulator filled the pauses between their questions. One of them knelt to inspect the intake filter, running a gloved finger along the housing. He did not say much, but he took photographs, logged numbers, and sealed his sample bottles with bright orange evidence tape. Outside, a breeze carried the smell of cut grass from the subdivision. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, a community built on the promise of control. Rebecca's SUV appeared again near the fence, this time followed by 2 board members I recognized from past meetings. They stood together, watching the county truck like it was an unwelcome guest. I could see confusion replacing confidence in the way Rebecca shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She walked toward the officers with that polished smile ready, voice bright, explaining that there had been concern about algae and that she had simply recommended proactive treatment. The officer listening to her did not react. He asked one question in a steady tone. Who authorized chemical application to a private reservoir connected to residential groundwater? There was a pause. The kind of pause that stretches thin and sharp in the Texas heat. Rebecca said something about community safety, about protecting children from contaminated water. The irony hung in the air thicker than the chlorine had that morning. The second officer approached me quietly and said, until lab results confirm safety, we recommend temporary suspension of downstream supply. I nodded. I had been waiting for that sentence since 9/17. I turned the manual valve another quarter rotation. The metal wheel groaned softly, and the flow gauge dipped. It was not a shutdown, not yet, but it was enough to trigger automated alerts in the subdivision's monitoring system. Within minutes, my phone vibrated with a notification from the county portal, precautionary advisory issued to affected residents. I could almost hear it ripple through the neighborhood faster than the wind across the water. Rebecca's posture changed. The practiced composure thinned. She looked from the officers to the lake to me, as if recalculating a math problem that suddenly included variables she had ignored. This was no longer about a private dock or a fishing line cast at sunrise. This was about infrastructure. And infrastructure does not care about popularity. The advisory hit the subdivision at 5:43 in the evening, right when families were turning on sprinklers and filling pasta pots for dinner. I did not need to check the neighborhood app to know what it said. Precautionary review of groundwater source. Temporary reduction in supply. Await further notice. I could hear it in the distance instead, a scattered rhythm of irrigation systems sputtering and then falling silent one by one. The sun was low now, turning the lake into a sheet of copper, and the surface looked almost innocent again if you ignored the faint streaks near the shoreline. The county officers had left with their samples and their measured expressions, promising lab results within 24 hours. I remained by the dock, listening to the familiar creak of wood under my boots and the soft lap of water against the posts. My phone finally lit up with Rebecca's name. She did not text. She called. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was controlled, but the edge was there, tight as stretched wire. She asked why I had escalated a minor issue into a county investigation. I reminded her that I had reported a contamination event in a private reservoir connected to residential wells. I used the same steady tone I use in public hearings, the kind that does not rise even when accused. She insisted that the board had authorized a preventative treatment based on concerns about stagnant water and public safety. I asked who on the board held a water treatment license. Silence answered that one. In the background, I could hear another voice, likely one of the board members, asking whether this meant they needed to provide bottled water. The word bottled seemed to land heavy between us. Rebecca shifted tactics, suggesting that perhaps we could handle this internally, that formal investigations create unnecessary panic. The irony almost made me smile. Panic does not come from procedure. It comes from secrets. I told her that once a chemical enters a shared watershed, it is no longer internal. I could picture her standing in her bright kitchen, looking out at lawns trimmed to regulation height, realizing that those manicured edges depended on something beyond her bylaws. A few minutes after we hung up, another notification arrived from the county portal. Residential advisory distributed. Monitoring ongoing. That meant official letters would follow, printed on heavy paper with seals and signatures that carry more authority than any HOA meeting agenda. Across the fence, porch lights flickered on earlier than usual, conversations rising in uncertain tones. The breeze carried faint snippets of concern, questions about pressure and safety. I walked back toward the pump house, keys cool in my palm, and checked the gauges again. Flow steady at reduced capacity. Intake stabilized. The system was holding. For years, Rebecca had treated the lake as a backdrop, a view to enhance property values. Tonight it had become what it always was, the source. And when you interfere with a source, the response does not shout. It measures, records, and moves forward with a patience that cannot be voted down. The lab results arrived the next morning at 8:12, just as the first sunlight cut across the dock and turned the water into glass. I opened the email standing exactly where my grandfather used to clean his tackle box, the boards cool beneath my boots. Chlorine concentration elevated beyond natural background levels. Trace markers consistent with commercial pool treatment compounds. Not agricultural runoff. Not seasonal fluctuation. Intentional introduction. The words felt clinical, almost polite, but they carried weight. I forwarded the report directly to the county environmental officer and attached a formal notice of confirmed contamination under the easement protection clause recorded with my water rights. Within 20 minutes my phone rang. The officer's voice was firmer than yesterday. Based on these findings, we are issuing a temporary suspension of groundwater distribution pending full remediation. Suspension, not reduction, not advisory. Suspension. I walked to the pump house without rushing, keys steady in my hand. Inside, the regulator hummed with the same calm rhythm it always had, unaware of the paperwork now moving through official channels. I placed my palm on the main valve wheel and turned it slowly until the gauge dropped to 0 on the subdivision line. The sound changed first, a low mechanical sigh as pressure equalized, then silence in that direction. The reservoir remained full, sunlight dancing across its surface, but the path outward was closed. Across the fence, the neighborhood shifted in tone. Sprinklers that had tried to start earlier in the morning clicked off entirely. A distant car door slammed harder than necessary. My phone began vibrating in waves. Unknown numbers. Neighbors I had met once at a barbecue asking what was happening. I answered calmly each time. I explained that contamination had been confirmed and that distribution was paused until safety could be guaranteed. I did not mention names. I did not speculate. Facts are enough when they are clear. Around 10 o'clock, Rebecca's SUV rolled up again, but this time she did not linger behind sunglasses. She stepped out quickly, heels sinking slightly into the soft edge of my property line, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice carried across the water, sharp and urgent. She was speaking to someone about emergency board authority, about temporary water delivery, about reputational damage. When she ended the call, she walked toward the fence without her usual composed stride. "You shut it off," she said, not asking. I nodded once. "The county did," I replied. "Procedure requires suspension after confirmed chemical introduction." The breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and for the first time since this started, she looked less like a president and more like a homeowner realizing something fundamental. The lake behind me shimmered, steady and patient. It had not changed sides. It had not taken revenge. It simply responded to interference the way systems are designed. To respond. Within the hour, an official county notice was posted online naming the reservoir as the contamination source and confirming investigation into unauthorized chemical application. The language was precise. The consequences were implied. Rebecca glanced at her phone as the notification arrived, and I watched the moment her expression shifted from control to comprehension. She had tried to treat a watershed like a decorative feature. Now the watershed was writing back. By midday the subdivision sounded different. Not louder, just strained. Without steady groundwater pressure, Every routine became noticeable. Toilets refilling slower. Washing machines pausing mid-cycle. The absence of something is louder than people expect. I stood inside the pump house reviewing remediation protocols on my tablet while the county portal updated in real time. Investigation status moved from preliminary to active review. The environmental officer called again, this time with a second voice on the line from the State Water Resources Board. They asked for my original easement documents and recharge capacity logs for the past 5 years. I had them scanned and organized before lunch. When you grow up around infrastructure, you learn to treat paperwork like another tool. Outside, a white delivery truck began dropping cases of bottled water at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates. The image was almost surreal. Identical homes, identical lawns, and stacks of plastic-wrapped water under a bright Texas sun. Rebecca had called an emergency board meeting at the clubhouse. I did not attend, but I did not need to. Neighbors began texting me directly, not with anger, but with questions. When would testing be complete? How long would restoration take? I answered each message the same way. Remediation requires flushing, filtration, and verified clearance. Safety first. Around 3 o'clock, Rebecca drove back to the fence, this time without sunglasses, without a phone in hand. She looked tired in a way I had not seen before. The wind had picked up slightly, pushing small ripples across the lake that caught the light like broken glass. She asked what it would take to restore distribution quickly. I explained that the contamination source needed to be identified formally, that a certified remediation plan had to be filed, and that costs associated with chemical introduction into a protected reservoir would likely fall on the party that authorized it. Her jaw tightened at the word authorized. For years, she had signed landscaping contracts and pool maintenance agreements as routine administrative acts. Now a signature meant liability. I could hear faint applause drifting from the clubhouse as someone inside likely announced temporary water delivery logistics. It sounded hollow against the steady rhythm of wind over water. Later that afternoon, the county posted an update confirming that chemical composition in the reservoir matched a batch recently purchased by a local contractor hired by the Homeowners Association for what was labeled proactive treatment. The language was neutral, but the implication was sharp. Rebecca read the update, standing a few feet from my fence. I watched her shoulders drop slightly as understanding settled in. This was no longer a disagreement about access or aesthetics. It was a documented environmental violation tied to a decision made under her leadership. The lake behind me remained calm, reflecting clouds that drifted slowly west. Systems do not argue. They respond. And in responding, they reveal exactly where responsibility lies. The remediation plan began before sunrise the next day. I was back at the pump house at 6:30, the air still cool enough to carry the scent of cedar instead of tension. County contractors arrived in 2 marked trucks, their equipment organized and efficient, hoses coiled neatly, filtration units mounted on trailers like mobile laboratories. They greeted me with brief nods and got to work without drama. Activated carbon filters were installed along the intake channel. Temporary containment booms stretched across the narrower cove, where chemical concentration had tested highest. It was not chaos. It was procedure. Across the fence, the subdivision looked unusually quiet for a weekday morning. No sprinklers, no lawn crews, just the low murmur of conversations drifting from driveways where neighbors stood holding unopened cases of bottled water. Rebecca did not appear immediately. Instead, one of the other board members walked up to the fence and asked what the timeline looked like. I explained that filtration would run continuously for at least 48 hours, followed by retesting at 12-hour intervals. Clearance would only be granted once chlorine levels returned to baseline and independent labs confirmed no residual compounds in the aquifer feed. He listened carefully, nodding in a way that suggested the board had shifted from control to compliance. Around 9 o'clock, Rebecca finally stepped out of her SUV. She looked composed again, but the confidence had softened into something more cautious. She did not approach the fence right away. She watched the contractors from a distance, arms folded, absorbing the scale of what her decision had triggered. The county environmental officer arrived shortly after, clipboard in hand, and spoke with her directly. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. Documentation, liability assessment, cost recovery. The phrases moved through the air like slow-turning gears. By midday, The county website updated with a formal notice. Unauthorized chemical application confirmed, remediation underway, responsible party subject to environmental penalties and reimbursement of response costs. The language was neutral, but the numbers attached were not. Fines calculated per day of contamination risk, plus full coverage of filtration, testing, and water delivery expenses. The subdivision's dependence on my reservoir was no longer an abstract concept. It was itemized. Rebecca's shoulders squared as she read the update on her phone. For a moment she looked toward the lake, not with entitlement, but with recognition. The water behind me reflected a wide Texas sky, steady and unbothered by human titles. I walked along the dock slowly, listening to the soft churn of the filtration units and the familiar lap against the wood. The system was correcting itself, layer by layer, filter by filter. Infrastructure does not hold grudges. It simply restores balance when given the chance. And balance, once restored, leaves a record that cannot be rewritten at the next board meeting. The final clearance notice arrived 3 days later at 4:14 in the afternoon, right as the sky shifted from hard blue to the softer gold that settles over Texas fields before sunset. I was standing at the edge of the dock again, the same boards beneath my boots, when my phone vibrated with the county seal on the screen. Laboratory confirmation. Chlorine levels returned to baseline. No residual compounds detected in aquifer feed. Distribution may resume. I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because I understood what it meant. I walked to the pump house slowly, listening to the steady breeze ripple across the surface behind me. The filtration units were already being dismantled, hoses drained and coiled with methodical care. County officials had finished their documentation that morning. Environmental penalties had been issued. Remediation costs calculated down to the gallon. The responsible party named clearly in the report. Rebecca Hale, acting in her capacity as president of the Homeowners Association, had authorized chemical treatment of a private reservoir without license or jurisdiction. The number attached to the fine was not small. It included county response, laboratory analysis, emergency water delivery, and mandatory environmental education compliance for the board. I reached the main valve and rested my hand on the metal wheel for a moment. Cool, solid, patient. When I turned it, the gauge climbed gradually, pressure building in a measured arc. The hum returned to the distribution line, deeper this time, steady and unhurried. Across the fence, the neighborhood shifted again. Sprinkler systems clicked back to life one by one. A cheer rose faintly from somewhere near the clubhouse, not loud, but relieved. Water returned not as a favor, not as a negotiation, but as a restored system following procedure. Rebecca stood near the fence as the pressure stabilized. She did not speak immediately. The past few days had reshaped her posture. The certainty was gone, replaced by something more grounded. She finally said that the board would be issuing a formal apology and restructuring its approval policies. She mentioned stepping down at the next meeting. Her voice did not carry the sharp edge it once had. It carried consequence. I nodded once, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. The lake behind me reflected the sky as it always had, unbothered by titles or votes. A pair of bass broke the surface near the reeds, small splashes marking their return to familiar patterns. The air smelled clean again, cedar and water and late-day warmth. My grandfather used to say that a reservoir teaches patience. It fills slowly. It drains slowly. And when disturbed, it takes time to clear. But once clear, it remembers its level. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the dock, I looked out over the 37 acres of steady water and listened to the quiet hum of restored flow moving toward 214 homes. Justice does not shout. It circulates. It measures. And when the valve turns back on, it does so because the source was protected all along.